I am pleased to have on the Everything Financial radio show today Mr. Jim Rogers. Jim is an international investor and author of Gifts to My Children, has one of the strongest followings in the investment and economic commentator community. And Jim, very much a pleasure to have you on the show today. I've been a big fan.
I am delighted to be here, Dennis. My pleasure.
Well, Jim, let me jump right in. The world, it seems, has reached its capacity for debt. At least that's the perspective of some commentators, and the euro appears to be on the brink. What's your take on euro and the Europe? How is this going to play out?
Well, we haven't quite reached the limit of debt. In the U.S., we're very close to it. Some countries are certainly past the limit, Greece, Ireland, places like that, but we're still more capacity. I mean, Germany could take on more debt and a few countries like that. But you're exactly right. In principle, the world is now realizing, oh, my gosh, we cannot just keep spending money we don't have. It's going to come to an end, and it is coming to an end. Whether it comes to an end in 2012 or 2015, I don't know, but you can certainly see the end is in sight down the road. I happen to own euros at the moment, so I hope the euro is going to survive at least another 10 hours or 10 days or 10 weeks or maybe even 10 months. But I'm not sure it'll be around in 10 years.
So, Jim, in your view, what should the European leaders and world leaders be doing to address some of Europe's problems?
There's really only one solution that will work. Unfortunately, most of these guys are just looking to get past the next election. If they can get past the next election, they'll think, well, then we'll worry about all this and we'll come up with solutions. They don't have it right, though, because the longer they delay, the higher the debt goes, and therefore the situation gets worse and worse and worse. The only real solution, Dennis, is to acknowledge the facts, acknowledge reality. There are people who are bankrupt. Let them go bankrupt, reorganize, and start over. Yes, bondholders would suffer. Shareholders would suffer. People who lent to banks would suffer badly. But the reality is they're bankrupt. Now, you can delay it and let them go deeper into debt and hope it's going to get better. But, of course, it's only going to get worse. And the longer they delay it, the worse it's going to be when the market finally says to the world, we're not going to put up with this anymore. We're pulling the rug out from under you. Then the whole system might collapse.
So, Jim, assuming that we've obviously got some politicians in Washington, D.C., here in the States that are, in a comical way, trying to address the deficit and debt issues, and we've got Europe with significant debt issues, do you see that the debt consequences will manifest themselves in Europe first, and then in the United States, or how do you see this playing out? With Fitch this week just coming out saying again that the U.S. credit rating is on negative watch, that rooster seems to be coming home to roost again.
Well, it's already raising its ugly head in Europe in pretty dramatic ways. You've seen what's been going on in the currency markets and in the stock markets as people worry about Greece, Spain, etc. That's because many of those debts are coming due this year. Last year, we were more worried about the U.S. I see the U.S. as a bigger problem. The U.S. as a whole is the largest debtor nation in the history of the world, and we have bankrupt states like Illinois, New York, California. In Europe, the entity as a whole doesn't have huge debts. Yes, Greece is bankrupt. Some of them have gigantic debts. But as a whole, they're not in such bad shape. So Europe is actually in less bad shape than the U.S. I would suspect the problems are going to rise in the U.S. In 2012, certainly in 2013, and then we're going to have real problems in the financial markets, because if you have Europe and the U.S. on the front pages of the newspapers, there's not much to save us unless, of course, some politician rises up. But Dennis, if some politician rises up, it's going to be because he's going to say, guys, we got to stop spending That would cause its own problems, but at least we would be on the way to dealing with things.
So, Jim, in listening to you, it sounds like you're of the opinion that there's no way to avoid the pain ahead. It's just, are we going to take the lesser pain now, or are we going to keep kicking the can down the road and endure greater pain later? Would that be a fair assessment of your opinion?
Oh, absolutely, Dennis. I mean, if you look at Europe, since we were talking about Europe, every one of those countries shows in their best plans shows that debt will be higher next year and the year after that and the year after that. No European country shows debt declining in the foreseeable future. No American state does. And the United States, of course, shows debt increasing by well over $1 trillion a year. So, no, the situation continues to get worse. The debt goes higher. Now, we can deal with the problem now or try to deal with it now and start over, or we can wait a few years. But as I said, when the market forces us to act, then the markets are in chaos. Then it's very difficult to make any kind of rational decision. Anything that happens will be a Band-Aid, and most of the Band-Aids will make things worse. If, Dennis, now they all got together in Europe, got into a room, said, all right, you guys are going to close, you guys are going to stay open, all the deposits are going to be okay, we'll ring-fence the banking system, it could survive now because enough countries have credibility, like Germany, Finland, a few places. But if they wait, it doesn't matter how many people get in the room. The market's going to be crashing around them, and then it's going to be too late to do anything. I suspect it is going to take that approach.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Jim. In the next segment, I certainly want to get your opinion on how this will affect potentially equity markets over the next couple of years and currency markets. If you're just joining us, this is the Everything Financial Radio Show. We're very privileged to be chatting with international investor and author of Gifts to My Children, Mr. Jim Rogers. And Everything Financial Radio will return after these words. We'll continue our conversation with Mr. Rogers. Stay with us.
Come on, listen to the money talk. The way you do it, money for nothing and your chicks for free.
Welcome back to Everything Financial Radio. I'm your host, Dennis Tubergen, and this is the Legacy Radio Network. We're glad you're with us today. Very happy to be chatting with Jim Rogers, international investor and author of Gifts to My Children, who's been gracious enough to join us today. Jim, prior to the break, you mentioned that if policymakers around the world don't address the debt problem soon, the markets, I think you said, will be crashing around them. So what's your opinion as to, assuming the politicians and policymakers keep kicking this can down the road, what happens to world equity markets? What happens to world stock markets?
Well, 2012 is an election year in the U.S., and the government and the central bank are going to do everything they can to make sure the politicians get reelected. They'll spend money, they'll print money in order to save themselves. Certainly by 2013, the game is going to be up in the financial markets, in stock markets around the world. Even in 2012, when they spend all that money and print all that money, the overall situation continues to decline. The debt goes higher and higher. The people who get the money, Dennis, are certainly better off, and their friends. But overall, the situation gets worse. In my own portfolio, I'm short stocks around the world. I own very few stocks. I'm short emerging markets, European stocks, American technology stocks, because I'm not terribly optimistic of going forward about the world economy. I am long commodities because if the world economy gets better, I'll make money because that big shortage is developing. If the world economy does not get better, they're going to print money. They're not going to make any money in stocks, the bad world economy. But when they print money, you might make money in real assets, silver, rice, whatever it happens to be, and I'm long some currencies.
Well, Jim, there's huge debate as to whether or not we're going into an inflationary environment depending on policy response, or if the overwhelming debt will create an environment similar to the environment we saw in the 1930s, and we go into a deflationary time frame. Which side of that argument do you come down on?
Well, the difference in the 30s and now is that all the central banks are sitting around ready to print money. I cannot conceive that in 2012, 2013, central bankers are going to say we're not going to print money. So whenever you've printed money throughout history, it's led to inflation. I would suspect we will have inflation first, and then we'll have the serious inflation, and that will lead to an inflationary collapse, which of course it will then lead to deflation around the world. But, in the Bernanke anyway, thinks that in the 30s the mistake was they didn't print money. He's got those printing presses ready to go. And many other central banks believe the same thing, and I don't think you're going to see any central banker in the world sitting around and not printing money if things continue to be soft.
A couple of weeks ago, I had Mr. Ian Gordon on the show, and he was of the opinion that what we're seeing now around the world is really the beginning of the failure of paper money, since there's no currencies in the world tied to something tangible like gold or a bimetal standard. What would your comment be on that position? Are we seeing a worldwide currency devaluation, and if so, how does the end game play out?
Well, there's little question that it's hard to find a sound paper of money anymore. Singapore dollars is philosophically sound, but if Singapore tries to be sound, they'll be out of business because they will not be able to compete with anybody. Canadian dollar is reasonably sound, but it too has the same problem. So he's right. There aren't any sound paper monies anymore. It may come a time, Dennis, when all of us are going to have to go back to barter or using silver or gold or whatever it happens to be, because paper money is being destroyed all over the world. It's going to be a very strange and interesting world 10 years from now as this crisis continues to develop, as bankruptcies develop, and as central banks print more money.
Jim, our listeners out there that have investments in 401ks and retirement plans and brokerage accounts, what advice would you give them?
Be very careful. Beware and be very careful, because the world we're entering is going to be more and more. There's going to be more turmoil in currencies, in stock markets, in all markets. We're going to have a lot more problems, and unless you know a lot about something, just don't invest in it at all, because we are facing some serious problems in the future.
And Jim, in the time we have left... Oh, go ahead, please.
I was going to say, learn about real assets such as silver, rice, things like that. And you might also learn to go short if you really want to start learning about making money in bad times.
Well, Jim, sure appreciate you joining us today. And in the time we have left, tell us, we've got just a couple minutes left, tell us about your most recent book and how someone could go about getting a hold of it.
Well, it's easier to get it. You can go to Amazon or any bookstore. I've had a few successes and lots of failures in my life, and then I suddenly had two little girls, so I wanted to start writing down some of these things as lessons for them. And next thing you know, I had a book, and it's turned into a book that they don't quite understand yet. They're only 3 and 8. What I'm finding is most of the adults like it, read it, and someday give it to their children too, for when their children are teenagers or when they're, in their 20s. But it's lessons that from my own failures and from my own triumphs.
Well, certainly appreciate you taking time out of your very hectic schedule to join us today from Singapore, and wishing you a terrific 2012, and both me and my listeners, thank you for joining us today.
Well, likewise, Dennis, it's been great fun, and I hope that everybody listening has a great 2012, or at least survives 2012.